The clock ticked steadily, echoing throughout the empty classroom as Mrs. Lillian Avino glanced at the remaining child seated in the back. Emma, the quiet, studious girl who rarely caused trouble, sat unmoving at her desk. The last bell of the day had rung nearly half an hour ago, and the usual chaos of students rushing out into the freedom of their weekends had long passed. But Emma remained, her small hands clutching a book as though it were her lifeline. Something was wrong. Emma was never one to linger, especially when the weekend beckoned with its promises of escape from the routine of school. Lillian approached her slowly, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. "Emma," she said softly, bending down to the girl's level. "It's time to go home, sweetheart. Your dad's here to pick you up." The girl's eyes remained glued to the window, where the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long golden shadows across the room. Emma didn't move, didn't acknowledge her teacher's voice at all. Lillian's brow furrowed as she followed Emma's gaze. Outside, in the schoolyard, she could see the figure of a man standing by the gate. His posture was stiff, his hands shoved into his pockets as he stared at the school building. Lillian squinted. Was that really Emma's father? The man looked familiar enough. Lillian had seen him before, picking Emma up on a few occasions. But there was something off. He didn't wave or smile as parents usually did when they came to retrieve their children. He just stood there, motionless, his face partially obscured by the brim of his baseball cap. A sense of unease crept over her, but she tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just tired after a long day at work. Maybe he was in a hurry. But then Emma's voice broke through the silence, soft and trembling. "That's not my dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. She turned back to the little girl, her expression shifting from gentle concern to sharp attention. "What do you mean, Emma?" she asked, her voice laced with caution. "He's picked you up before, hasn't he?" Emma's grip on the book tightened, her knuckles turning white. "That's not him," she repeated, her eyes wide and fearful. "Mommy said she was coming today. She told me this morning." Lillian stood up, her mind racing. She had met Emma's mother before, a kind, attentive woman who always made sure to confirm any changes to Emma's pickup schedule. If Emma's mother had said she was coming, why was this man here? And more importantly, why was Emma so adamant that he wasn't her father? Lillian glanced out the window again. The man hadn't moved. He was still there, his eyes fixed on the school, waiting. Something was definitely wrong. "I'm gonna call your mom," Lillian said, forcing a reassuring smile onto her face. "We'll sort this out, okay?" Emma nodded slightly, but the fear in her eyes didn't dissipate. As Lillian pulled out her phone, her fingers trembled slightly. She dialed the number listed in the school's database under Emma's mother and waited, each ring of the phone making her pulse quicken. After what felt like an eternity, the call went to voicemail. "Hi, this is Anna. I can't take your call right now, but please leave a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." Lillian hesitated before leaving a message. "Hi, Mrs. Dalton. This is Lillian Avino, Emma's teacher. There's a bit of confusion here. Emma says you were supposed to pick her up today, but there's a man outside waiting for her. Could you please call me back as soon as possible?" She hung up, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She returned to Emma's side, kneeling beside the girl once more. "I called your mom, but I couldn't reach her," Lillian said softly. "I'm sure she'll call back soon. In the meantime, why don't we wait here together?" Emma nodded, her eyes darting nervously between the window and the door. Lillian's heart ached for the girl. There was no mistaking the terror in her expression. Emma was genuinely afraid of the man outside, and Lillian's own instincts, honed over years of teaching and caring for children, told her that something was very wrong. She glanced at the clock again. The school was nearly empty now. Most of the staff had left for the weekend, and only a few teachers remained, finishing up paperwork or preparing lesson plans for the following week. The hallways were silent, and the usual bustle of children and parents had faded into the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Lillian's mind raced. What if Emma was right? What if that man wasn't her father? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She stood up abruptly. "Emma, stay here," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'm going to check something." Emma's eyes widened in alarm, and she reached out, grabbing Lillian's hand. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Lillian squeezed the girl's hand gently. "I won't be long," she promised. "I just need to talk to someone." Reluctantly, Emma let go, and Lillian hurried out of the classroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way down the empty hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she reached the front office, she spotted the school's security officer, Mr. Patterson, standing by the door. He was a tall, imposing man with a calm demeanor that usually put the students and staff at ease. Today, however, his expression was tense as he glanced out the window. "Lillian," he said, his voice low. "There's a man outside claiming to be one of the students' fathers, but something about him doesn't feel right." Lillian's pulse quickened. "It's Emma," she said, her voice tight. "She says he's not her father." Mr. Patterson's brows furrowed in concern. "Are you sure?" Lillian nodded. "She's terrified, Patterson. She told me her mom was supposed to pick her up today, and now she's refusing to leave with him." Patterson glanced out the window again, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Let's call the police, just to be safe." Lillian's throat tightened, but she nodded in agreement. She had no reason to doubt Emma, and her instincts were screaming at her to take action. Patterson reached for the phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Lillian stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly together as she listened to his calm, measured voice relay the details of their concern. "We'll send officers right away," the dispatcher assured them. "Stay with the child and keep her safe. Do not engage with the man outside." As Patterson hung up, Lillian's thoughts whirled with 1,000 possibilities. What if the man tried to force his way into the school? What if he was dangerous? She had to protect Emma. She couldn't let anything happen to her. "I'm going back to the classroom," Lillian said, her voice shaking slightly. "Emma's scared." Patterson nodded, his expression grim. "Go. I'll keep an eye on the man. If he tries anything, I'll stop him." Lillian hurried back to her classroom, her mind racing. When she entered, Emma was sitting exactly where she had left her, her small body curled up in the chair, her eyes wide with fear. Lillian closed the door behind her, locking it quietly. "Emma," she said softly, "I talked to Mr. Patterson, and he's going to make sure that man doesn't come inside." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded silently. "But the police are on their way, and they're going to help us figure this out. No one is going to take you anywhere you don't want to go." Emma sniffled, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her sweater. "What if he tries to come in?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lillian knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "He won't," she promised. "I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you." But even as she spoke the words, a part of her feared that the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Emma's small body trembled as she sat, staring at the door as though expecting the man to burst through at any second. Lillian stayed close, her heart racing as she tried to keep both of them calm. The school was eerily quiet now. The other teachers had left, and the once busy corridors were empty and still. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cool evening air. Then, suddenly, a knock echoed through the door. Emma's breath hitched, and Lillian's pulse skyrocketed. She rose slowly, pressing her ear to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mrs. Aveno," a voice called softly. "It's Patterson. The police are here." Relief flooded her, and she quickly unlocked the door, letting Patterson and 2 uniformed officers into the room. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes scanning the room before turning their attention to Emma. One of them, a tall woman with kind eyes, crouched beside the girl. "Hi, Emma," she said gently. "I'm Officer Reyes. I'm here to help you, okay? Can you tell me what's going on?" Emma looked up at the officer, her eyes brimming with tears. "That man?" "He's not my dad," she whispered. Officer Reyes exchanged a glance with her partner before turning back to the girl. "Okay," she said softly. "We believe you. Do you know who he is?" Emma shook her head, her lips trembling. "No," she whispered. "I've never seen him before. Mommy said she was coming today." Lillian's heart ached as she watched the girl, her small body hunched in fear. She wanted to scoop Emma up in her arms and protect her from everything, but all she could do was stand by and let the officers handle the situation. Officer Reyes straightened up, her expression serious as she turned to Lillian. "Do you have a way to contact Emma's mother?" she asked. Lillian nodded. "I called her earlier, but it went to voicemail. I left a message, but I haven't heard back." Reyes frowned. "We'll try reaching her again. In the meantime, we're going to talk to the man outside and see what his story is." Patterson led the officers out of the classroom, and Lillian moved to Emma's side, sitting beside her as they waited. The tension in the room was thick, and Lillian could feel Emma's fear as though it were her own. "They're going to fix this," she said softly, trying to reassure both Emma and herself. Outside, the sound of the officers' voices drifted through the window, though the words were muffled and indistinct. Lillian couldn't see the man from where she sat, but she could feel his presence lingering just outside the school. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, and then, suddenly, the door burst open, and Officer Reyes hurried back inside. Her expression was grim. "We've detained the man," she said, her voice tight. "He was trying to leave when we approached him. We're still trying to verify his identity, but something about his story doesn't add up." Lillian's stomach twisted. "What did he say?" she asked. Reyes hesitated for a moment before answering. "He claimed to be Emma's father, but when we asked him basic questions, like her birthday or her mother's name, he couldn't answer. He seemed nervous, like he was hiding something." Emma's breath hitched, and she clutched Lillian's hand tightly. "I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's not my dad." Reyes nodded. "I believe you, Emma," she said gently. "We're going to keep you safe." Lillian's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was this man? Why was he trying to take Emma? And where was her mother? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers. Not yet. Officer Reyes excused herself to make another call, and Lillian sat with Emma, her heart heavy with worry. Time seemed to crawl as they waited for news. Every second felt like an eternity, and the weight of the unknown pressed down on both of them. Finally, after what felt like hours, Reyes returned. Her expression was grave as she approached Lillian. "We just spoke to Emma's mother," she said, her voice low. "She confirmed that she was supposed to pick Emma up today. She didn't send anyone else." Lillian's heart sank. The situation had just taken a darker turn. "Did she say anything else?" Lillian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reyes hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering to Emma before she spoke. "She mentioned someone from her past, someone who might have had a reason to take Emma." Lillian's blood ran cold. "Who?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Reyes took a deep breath before answering. "Emma's mother has an ex-husband, a man she hasn't seen in years. He never accepted their divorce, and he blames Emma for it." Lillian's heart pounded in her chest as she processed the officer's words. This wasn't just some random stranger trying to take Emma. This was personal, and it was far more dangerous than Lillian had realized. "Does Emma's mother think it's him?" she asked, her voice shaking. Reyes nodded. "She's afraid it might be. She's on her way to the station now, but she's terrified. She thought he was out of their lives for good." Emma was trembling beside her, her small body hunched over as though trying to make herself disappear. Lillian wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. What if they hadn't caught the man in time? What if he had managed to take Emma before anyone realized what was happening? The thought made her stomach churn with dread. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the once bright schoolyard was now bathed in shadows. The building was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. Lillian felt as though they were trapped in some kind of nightmare. waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. Minutes stretched into hours as they waited for more news. Officers came and went, speaking in hushed tones as they moved through the school. Lillian stayed by Emma's side, refusing to leave her for even a moment. Finally, just as the clock struck 7, Emma's mother arrived at the school. She burst into the classroom, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She rushed to Emma, pulling her into a tight embrace as tears streamed down her face. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Emma clung to her mother, burying her face in her shoulder as she sobbed. Lillian watched them, her heart aching for both of them. The relief was palpable, but the fear hadn't fully dissipated. Not yet. Officer Reyes stepped forward, her expression serious. "Mrs. Dalton, we need to talk about your ex-husband," she said quietly. Mrs. Dalton nodded, wiping her tears as she sat down beside Emma. "I never thought he would do something like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We haven't seen him in years. I thought he was gone." Reyes nodded. "We're still trying to verify the man's identity, but based on what you've told us, it seems likely that it's him." Mrs. Dalton's hands shook as she clutched Emma tightly. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reyes sighed, her expression grim. "We'll keep him in custody while we investigate, but if he is your ex-husband, he may have some legal rights to visitation. It could get complicated." Mrs. Dalton's face went pale, and she shook her head fiercely. "No," she whispered. "I won't let him near Emma. Not after this." Lillian's stomach churned as she listened to the conversation. How could this man have any legal claim to Emma after what he had done? The thought of him being allowed anywhere near the girl again made her blood boil. But as much as she wanted to reassure Mrs. Dalton, she knew the situation was far from simple. The hours dragged on as the police continued their investigation. Lillian stayed at the school long after she normally would have gone home, unwilling to leave Emma's side until she knew for certain that the girl was safe. Finally, just after midnight, Officer Reyes returned with an update. "We've confirmed the man's identity," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's your ex-husband, Mrs. Dalton. He'll be charged with attempted abduction." Mrs. Dalton let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she clutched Emma tightly. "Thank God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face once more. Lillian felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tinged with exhaustion. The day had been long and terrifying, and the weight of it all was finally catching up to her. As the police finished their work and the school emptied out, Lillian finally allowed herself to breathe. Emma was safe. The man who had tried to take her was in custody. But even as the relief settled over her, Lillian knew that the memory of this day would linger for a long time. Some nightmares didn't end just because the danger had passed. Some nightmares left scars that took a lifetime to heal. As she walked to her car, the school now dark and empty, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Emma's family would have to face the legal battle ahead, and the trauma of what had nearly happened would leave its mark. But for tonight at least, Emma was safe, and that was enough.